In 1017, two little princes, no more than babies, arrived in Sweden. These tiny infants were sons of the brave English king, Edmund Ironside, who had died at the end of the previous year, leaving his rival, the Dane Cnut, free to establish himself as the only king in England. It seems more than probable that Edmund Ironside was murdered, and now the future of his sons was in grave peril as well. These little boys were named Edward and Edmund, and for Canute they must be got rid of. Among the potential rivals that Canute had already eliminated included Eadwig, an uncle of the prince's, who was immensely popular, and whose death was greeted with great shock and horror. Aware that the murder of two innocent babies would do nothing for his reputation among his new English subjects, Canute decided that he could ill afford to carry out the terrible deed himself, and so he sent Edward and Edmund to the court of King Olaf of Sweden, with the implication that the two princes were to be put to death. But Olaf was by no means disposed to execute Canute's wishes, evidently taking pity on the innocent boys. So Edward and Edmund avoided their lives being cut short before they had even begun, but instead their life of exile had only just started. They arrived in Hungary, where they grew to manhood at the court of the Hungarian king Stephen. Indeed, Edmund would spend the remainder of his life in Hungary, dying there at some point in the 1050s, although Edward would eventually return to England. More on that in a moment. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicles relates how Edward at least began to prosper, despite being exiled from the land of his birth. He grew to be a great man who evidently made an advantageous marriage to a woman named Agatha. Florence of Worcester says that Agatha was a niece of the Holy Roman Emperor Henry III, although there are some question marks over Agatha's origins. However, whoever Agatha was the daughter of, there is little doubt that she came from a family of considerable stature, and it is most likely that she was, at the very least, a close relative of Henry III. With Agatha, Edward would build a fine family with three children, one boy, Edgar, and two girls, Christina, who would become a nun, and Margaret, who married King Malcolm III of Scotland, and who would, in the mid 13th century, be made a saint for her charitable works. So it seems that life had been relatively kind to Edward the Exile, banished as he was from his homeland. But in 1057, Edward would heed the call of his uncle, Edward the Confessor, and finally return to England. Edward the Confessor was a half brother of Edmund Ironside, and he remained, for one reason or another, without an heir. Duke William of Normandy was living under the impression that the English king had promised him the crown during William's visit to Edward's court in 1051, but this seems rather doubtful, given that King Edward was now, 6 years later, sending for his nephew, whom, no doubt, he had previously presumed to be dead, although this does not rule out the possibility that Edward the Confessor simply changed his mind over his choice of successor. Certainly, Florence of Worcester was in no doubt as to King Edward's motivations for recalling his exiled nephew. The king was, Florence says, determined to appoint him, Edward the Exile, his heir and successor. If Florence is correct with his terminology, then the fact that King Edward was seemingly absolutely fixed in his mind as to who should succeed him certainly makes a mockery of Duke William's version of events. So Edward the Exile finally returned to the country that he had been born in, and to the land that he may already have been king over, had the dramatic events of 1016 played out in favour of his courageous father. No doubt, Edward's return would have been a happy occasion. The exiled prince could rejoice in the thought that he could now reclaim the inheritance that had been stolen from him by Canute, whilst Edward the Confessor, at long last, had a definite heir. But, alas, fate as so often the case in the 11th century, altered course quickly and drastically. Shortly after his return to England, Edward the Exile died in London. He was aged 40 or 41, with his death described by the Anglo Saxon chronicles as being to the misfortune of this wretched nation. It was a sad blow for the English crown, and Edward the Confessor was, in a sense, back to square one when it came to the succession. There was some hope still in the shape of Edward the Exile's son, Edgar, now aged about 5 years old. But Edgar would be shoved to one side after the monumental events of 1066 as Duke William transformed himself into William the Conqueror. Nonetheless, Edgar would invoke some of the fighting spirit that his grandfather, Edmund Ironside, had been blessed with, and he would continue to fight for the crown that had been denied to his father, Edward the Exile. Edgar would look for support from far and wide, from England, Denmark, and Scotland, where his sister, Margaret, was queen. But there would be no happy ending for this long and sorrowful tale of princely disinheritance. The Normans were far too ruthless to be unseated. The death knell of Anglo Saxon England didn't really begin at Hastings with the death of the Chancellor, Harold Godwinson, whose claims to the crown were every bit as flimsy as Duke William's, but instead it rang with the death of Edward the Exile. Like Edgar, Edward was clearly a courageous man, as one might expect from the son of Edmund Ironside, and with his ancient ties to the English crown, Edward the Exile certainly would have made a worthy successor to Edward the Confessor, if only he had lived.